Hi, welcome back to CBSE Economics. I welcome you all. We have been seeing Keynesian economics and we have learned the equilibrium level of income, employment and output in the economy, and we have seen many other concepts. Today we will be discussing about excess demand or inflationary gap. What exactly is excess demand or inflationary gap? We have seen earlier the economy will be at equilibrium when aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. When aggregate demand AD is equal to aggregate supply. We have also learned at the equilibrium point the planned savings are equivalent to planned investment. Ex ante savings are equivalent to ex ante investment. That is AD is equal to AS. AD stands for C plus I and A stands for C plus S, and CC gets cancelled. So at the equilibrium level of income, employment and output, 1 AD is equal to S, and 2 automatically savings are equivalent to investment. Now we will be discussing about excess demand or inflationary gap. What exactly is excess demand? At the equilibrium level of income, employment and output, the economy has reached the full employment level of income, employment and output, where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. All of a sudden the demand, aggregate demand goes up, AD. So there is a difference between AD and AS. Aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply at the full employment level. That situation is called excess demand. How do you define excess demand? If aggregate demand is for a level of output more than aggregate demand required at the full employment level, that situation is called excess demand. And the gap created between the actual aggregate demand and the aggregate demand required at the full employment level, that gap is called inflationary gap. So we'll take a numerical example. Suppose the aggregate demand and aggregate supply are equal at the full employment level, let's say $200 billion, and all of a sudden AD goes up to $400 billion. So then the gap is created between AD and AS of $200 billion. That's called excess demand. That is, demand is greater than supply at the full employment level. And the gap between AD and AS at the full employment level is called inflationary gap. I repeat, if aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply at the full employment level, that situation is called excess demand, and the gap created between the actual aggregate demand and the aggregate demand required at the full employment level is called inflationary gap. Let's present this with the help of a graphical presentation here. So this graph clearly shows on the x-axis, you can see it here, income, output, employment level, all are taken here. Income is taken, output is taken, employment level is going. If you go this way, income will increase, output will increase, employment level will increase, everything is increasing here. On the y-axis, we can see aggregate demand is showed here, AD, C plus I. See, this is the 45 degrees line. We already discussed income line or aggregate supply line. This is the guiding line to find out the equilibrium level of income, employment and output. And this AD curve, this is the full employment level of equilibrium AD curve, aggregate demand curve. This keep on increasing. This AD and AS, they become equal at this point, E, equilibrium point. This original actual, this is the full employment level aggregate demand, they become equal by producing OQ level of output. At this output, OQ is equal to EQ because this is the 45 degrees line. This is the full employment equilibrium. And all of a sudden the AD has gone up from AD to AD1. This you can see it here. AD has gone up from AD to AD1. This is the actual aggregate demand now. This may be because of increase in the government expenditure, or maybe there are more investments are coming from abroad. So all of a sudden AD has gone up. And now you see a gap here. Now the actual aggregate demand is TQ and the full employment aggregate demand is EQ. So this gap between actual aggregate demand TQ and the full employment level TEQ, that is equal to TE. That's called inflationary gap. So that is actual aggregate demand. This we write it here, TQ minus EQ. So that is equal to TE. This is your inflationary gap. This is your, you can write it here, this is inflationary gap. This much is the inflation happened here. That means it shows the inflation level in the economy. Repeat once again, what is excess demand? Excess demand, if aggregate demand in the economy is greater than aggregate supply at the full employment level. If AD is greater than AS at the full employment level, that situation is called excess demand. AD is simply AD is greater than AS at the full employment level. And the gap created between the actual aggregate demand and the aggregate demand required at the full employment level is called inflationary gap. If aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply at the full employment level, that situation is called excess demand, and the gap created between the actual aggregate demand and the aggregate demand required at the full employment level is called inflationary gap. This is explained with the help of a graph. On the x-axis we got output, income, employment. On the y-axis AD, we have seen it. E is the equilibrium point. This is the full employment equilibrium point E. This is AD, full employment level. AD is equal to AS here. Because of increase in AD has gone up from AD to AD1. That's the actual aggregate demand now. Now the actual aggregate demand in the economy is TQ and the full employment aggregate demand is EQ. So this TE is the inflationary gap. What is the impact of inflationary gap or excess demand? So we can see it here. Number one, output cannot be increased because of increase in AD, aggregate demand. Why output cannot be increased? Because in the economy, all the resources have been fully and efficiently utilized. There's no way we can increase the output. Number two, income cannot go up. National income at the full employment is maximum. It cannot go beyond that. National income cannot go up. We see output cannot increase. Number three, employment level cannot go up because already there is full employment in the economy. That is, people who are willing to work and able to work at the existing wage rate have been fully employed. Output cannot increase, income cannot increase, employment level cannot increase. Then actually what happens, the fourth point here, effects of inflationary gap or excess demand. Only one thing can happen in the economy, that is, it leads to inflation, rise in prices. We call it demand pull inflation because demand is pulling. As a result, the prices of the commodities will go up. Only one thing, it has an impact. So I repeat once again, the impact of excess demand. Number one, output cannot be increased because all the resources have been fully and efficiently utilized. Number two, income cannot be increased because the maximum national income is achieved. Number three, employment level cannot go up because already all the people have been fully employed. And only one thing can happen, that is the prices of the commodities will go up. It leads to demand pull inflation in the economy. So to sum it up, what is excess demand? If aggregate demand is for a level of output more than aggregate demand required at the full employment level, that situation is called excess demand. And the gap created between the actual aggregate demand and the aggregate demand required at the full employment level is called inflationary gap. This is shown with the help of a graph. On the x-axis we got output, income, employment. On the y-axis we got aggregate demand. So this is the E is the equilibrium level of income, output and employment, full employment level. Because of increase in AD curve has shifted from AD to AD1. As a result, the gap is created between the actual aggregate demand TQ and the full employment aggregate demand EQ, that is TE. This we call it as inflationary gap. the impact on the economy is nothing can happen. Output cannot increase, income cannot increase, employment level cannot increase. So only one impact it will have. It leads to demand pull inflation. Price of commodities will go up and it leads to inflation in the economy, nothing else. So that's all we have time for this video. Till we meet next time, it's goodbye from Saddam Hussein.